thank you for calling this very important hearing. Mr. Chairman, you are absolutely right. This is more important than one election. The revelations that have come forward so far provides us with a moment pregnant with transformation. Not transformation for a moment, but for generations to come and generations yet unborn. That's why this hearing must be about two essential things: truth and trust. The American people expect the IRS to exercise its responsibilities in a fair and nonpartisan manner. When the IRS breaches that trust, it damages the ability of the agency to implement the nation's tax laws effectively and efficiently. The Inspector General has called the actions by IRS employees in Cincinnati, quote, inappropriate, unquote. But after reading the IG's report, I think it goes well beyond that. I believe that there was gross incompetence and mismanagement in how the IRS determined which organizations qualified for tax-exempt status. Again, this is about truth and trust. By now, we have all heard how IRS employees use terms like Tea Party and Patriots to single out conservative groups for enhanced scrutiny. But the IG report also discusses how some cases took more than 3 years to resolve. Ladies and gentlemen, we're better than that. We are simply better than that. IRS staff stopped working for more than a year, from October 2010 through November 2011, while they waited for guidance from supervisors on how to process these applications. This is simply unacceptable. When the IRS finally got to processing applications, employees with little or no oversight sent overly extensive requests for information to many of these groups, which understandably angered them. New processes have been put in place to prevent these abuses in the future, but much more needs to be done. According to the IG audit, at least part of the reason for this mismanagement is inadequate guidance on how to process these cases. The original statute passed by Congress requires 501c4 organizations engaged exclusively in social welfare activities. But in 1959, the Treasury Department issued a regulation that requires these entities only to be primarily engaged in social welfare activities. As a result, many groups now believe they can spend up to 49% of their funds on campaign-related activities. Significant concerns also have been raised about groups that have already qualified for tax-exempt status, or whose applications are still pending and are now openly engaging in campaign-related activities and spending millions of dollars with little or no IRS oversight of their activities. These concerns are not limited to just one political party, by the way. For example, good government groups like Democracy 21 and others have written to the IRS about Crossroads GPS, which was created by Karl Rove, as well as Patriots USA, which was created by former Obama administration officials. I'm encouraged that the IG has already announced that he will be examining this issue in more detail in the upcoming audit. But it is also time to revisit the 1959 regulation and consider returning to the original standard set forth in the statute that bans political activity by these groups altogether, which is what Congress originally intended. As we investigate the actions of IRS employees, I urge my colleagues to avoid making the investigation into a partisan attack. Let me pause here to say that there are many great employees in the IRS. I'm sure the chairman would agree with me that it's not our intention to take a broad brush and say negative things about all the employees at the IRS, because there are many hardworking people who are probably looking at this event right now, wondering, why are they talking about me? Well, we say to all of those employees, we appreciate what you're doing, but we're trying to make sure that this organization is straightened out. Mr. Shulman, who was the head of the IRS when all of these actions occurred, was appointed by President Bush. And there's no evidence to suggest that he directed IRS employees to intentionally delay or harass Tea Party groups. Similarly, the Inspector General and all IRS officials who have appeared before Congress to date have agreed that no one outside the IRS participated in these activities or was aware of them when they occurred. These facts were confirmed again yesterday when the committee conducted a transcribed interview of Holly Paz, who served as manager of the Rulings and Agreements Office in Washington, D.C., which oversees the Cincinnati unit that processed these applications. I share the chairman's very serious questions about why Mr. Shulman and Ms. Lerner failed to inform Congress about these problems. Again, ladies and gentlemen, we're talking about truth and trust. To me, this is one of their most significant failures, and I do not believe their answers to date have been sufficient. Truth and trust. As the committee continues in what I hope will be a bipartisan and thorough investigation, I want to make a request of the chairman. Now that the president has designated Danny Werfel as the new acting director of the IRS, I believe the committee should hear from him about his plans to address the recommendations in the IG report and other steps he intends to take to restore the public trust in the IRS. As I've said repeatedly, to do our jobs on this committee, we must focus on oversight and reform. Holding a hearing with Mr. Werfel will allow us to do both. Finally, Mr. Chairman, I would like to say a brief word about Ms. Lerner. Her attorney has written to the committee to inform us that she intends to invoke her Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. Of course, I am disappointed that we will not be able to ask her questions today. I believe that she could shed much light on what we are trying to find, the truth. But every member of this committee takes an oath to support the Constitution of the United States of America. And this is Ms. Lerner's right under the Constitution. So I will honor her decision, and I respectfully urge all of my colleagues to do the same. I ask unanimous consent to place into the record written answers that Ms. Lerner provided in response to questions posed by the Inspector General, as well as similar answers provided by her boss, Joseph Grant.
They will not be accepted at this time. They have not been provided to us by the IG on a bipartisan basis, I've been informed. So at this time, we will take them under advisement. They will be, I will take back my reservation, If after Mr. George has viewed them and agreed that in fact they are true, or someone else from the IG, and I must mention, I'm shocked that I'm finding things that we want being delivered now.
They were provided last night, I understand.
They were not provided to us. The committee has respectfully requested all of these transcribed interviews from the IG. Mr. George, am I to assume that this was the only one provided, or were all of them provided to the minority?
Mr. Chairman, I've been informed that they were provided to both sides last night.
Well, there's a way to get them to us to where we know they're there. Can we? No, that's all right. That's all right. Will we expect to receive all transcribed interviews or only this one? We've asked for all of them equally.
We prioritize them, sir. We're still working on the requests.
Can we get an estimate of time, as long as we're at this point, this juncture? By the way, I'll take back my reserve, but
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Sir, we're working on the request. We've prioritized them as requested by the committee. I cannot give you at this very moment a definitive time for your receipt of them.
I trust it will be no greater time than we give taxpayers to respond. With that, unanimous consent is accepted. It will be placed in the record.
Mr. Chairman, let me make one comment very briefly on what just happened. Mr. Chairman, we would not submit. We were under the impression that you all had the document, and you said some things that implied that we were trying to go faster.
It wasn't you blindsiding me, I assure you.
Very well. And as I close, I want this committee to be very careful, and I've said it many times. This committee should act on the level of a federal court. And I think we need to be very, very careful not to let partisanship undermine the integrity, not only of the committee, but of our investigation and our work product. The American people are depending upon us, and I have full faith and confidence in the chairman and all of our members that we will do as I just said. And so I certainly look forward to our witnesses' answers to our questions today. I look forward to your opening statements. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank you, Mr. Cummings. We now go to the chairman of the subcommittee, Mr. Jordan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. 2 rogue agents. That's what the White House tells us were the people responsible for this. In fact, I got a news report from May 15th. It says, White House aides, 2 rogue IRS employees from Cincinnati were responsible for investigating conservative groups. 2 employees in Cincinnati responsible for the systematic targeting of conservative groups for over 2 years. This administration would have us believe that. This administration, this agency, the very agency charged with enforcing Obamacare, systematically targeted groups who came into existence because they opposed Obamacare, and they started the targeting the very month, March 2010, that Obamacare became law, expects us to believe it was just the work of 2 rogue agents. This administration, this agency, which according to Mr. George's report found out about this practice certainly as early as June of 2011, and after that date, Ms. Lerner had 14 opportunities in direct and distinct interactions with the Ways and Means Committee and with this committee, 14 different occasions where she could have set the record straight, and she chose not to do it, and yet they expect us to believe that the systematic targeting of conservative groups was just the work of 2 rogue agents in Cincinnati. This administration, this agency, which was so calculating that they planted the question 12 days ago when Ms. Lerner gave the news that the IRS was engaged in this targeting before the IG's report came out, so calculating they all got together and said, let's do this, let's plant the question and break this story, and yet they expect us to believe it was just the work of a couple employees, 2 rogue agents in Cincinnati. And finally, Mr. Chairman, I would say this. subject that this committee knows something about. This administration, which told us and told the American people that the attack that killed 4 Americans in Benghazi was caused by a video, is now the same administration who expects us to believe that this scandal was just the result of 2 rogue agents in Cincinnati. Mr. Chairman, the people don't buy it. The American people get it. And they just want this administration to give them the truth. And that's why this hearing is so important. And I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. I understand Mr. Lynch will, on behalf of the ranking member, Mr. Lynch is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you and the ranking member for holding this timely hearing. I'd also like to thank the witnesses for coming forward, helping the committee with its work. Mr. Chairman, each year the State Department releases its country report on human rights and practices. It's a comprehensive assessment of human rights conditions across the world. Notably, the overview of the country report released this year provides that sustainable democracy means more than just elections, and includes a quote from President Obama's remarks at the United Nations in September of 2012, defining true democracy as dependent on the freedom of citizens to speak their minds and assemble without fear, on the rule of law and due process that guarantees the rights of all people. The country report goes on to conclude that these elements of democracy, particularly the freedom of expression and the freedom of speech, face serious threats around the globe in 2012. I just want to point to a couple of these examples offered by our own State Department. While the law in the People's Republic of China provides for freedom of speech and freedom of the press, the report states that authorities generally do not respect these rights in practice. In particular, those who made politically sensitive comments in public speeches, academic discussions, and comments to the media remain subject to punitive measures. And the government frequently monitored gathering of intellectual scholars and dissidents where political or sensitive issues were discussed. And similarly, in the Republic of Belarus, the national constitution provides for freedom of the speech and freedom of press, but the authoritarian regime in place also does not respect the rights in practice. Specifically, it says individuals could not criticize the government publicly or discuss matters of general public interest without fear of reprisal. Authorities videotaped political meetings, conducted frequent identity checks, and used other forms of intimidation. In my view, these and other blatant violations of individual freedom of expression serve to illustrate exactly what is at stake when a federal agency, for whatever reason, targets U.S. citizens based on their political beliefs. Such a practice compromises one of the bedrock principles of our democracy, the commitment to ensure that all citizens are free to exercise their freedom of speech without fear of retribution from their government. And it constitutes a significant infringement on human rights in this country. It is why the facts set forth in the audit report issued by the Treasury Inspector General are deeply troubling and reveal an IRS practice that is unacceptable. According to the Inspector General, the criteria used by the IRS Determinations Unit in Cincinnati to identify tax-exempt applications for further review include specific organization names, such as Tea Party and Patriots, as well as policy positions such as government spending. In any case file, and this is what gets me, any case file statements that criticize how the country is being run. Anything that criticizes the government on how this country is being run, that was subject to enhanced investigation by the IRS. The Inspector General has also reported that many of these organizations had not received an approval or denial letter from the IRS for more than 2 years after submitting their applications, and in some instances remained open as long as over 1,000 calendar days. Moreover, the audit report notes that the same determination units sent out burdensome request letters for additional information, 58% of which the Inspector General has characterized as unnecessary. In light of these and other reports, it's my hope that today's hearing will serve to build upon the investigation conducted by Inspector General George and assist our committee in determining how we can better ensure that such practices are never repeated within the federal government. But there's something else at play here. If this committee is prevented by obstruction or by refusal to answer the questions that we need to get to the bottom of this, you will leave us no alternative but to ask for the appointment of a special prosecutor or appointment to special counsel to get to the bottom of this. This is a very serious matter. We would like to handle it in this committee. But if I watched the last hearing where the witness or the IRS had no names and no direction as to who led these investigations, who chose the terms to be used, and basically stonewalled the committee. That cannot continue. We know where that will lead. It will lead to a special prosecutor. It will lead to special counsel being appointed to get to the bottom of this. So I hope that's not the approach of the IRS going forward, because there will be hell to pay if that's the route that we chose to go down. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentleman